I'm Sikandar Kermani. I'm the BBC correspondent covering Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I'll introduce the rest of the panel. We have Rania Abu Zaid, who is an award-winning journalist who's reported from a long list of countries that it would take me too long to all name, but they include Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and here in Pakistan, I believe, for outlets including The Guardian, The New Yorker, Time, and she's written a book, No Turning Back, Life and Loss and Life, Loss and Hope in Wartime Syria. It's a fantastic book that really details the trajectory of the conflict, the uprising in Syria from its beginning in 2011 through to present day, more or less, detailing how it changed from a peaceful revolution to an armed revolution, and the growing influence of Islamist groups as well, and the groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. We also have Osama bin Javed, who is a journalist with Al Jazeera, who's also reported from Syria and many other countries around the Middle East, and also previously was at Dawn News, I believe, in Pakistan, and has recently been nominated for an Emmy Award for coverage of the blockade in Qatar. And Lali Snow, who's a photojournalist and journalist who has covered Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Palestinian territories in Israel. I believe you will be talking about your own book in a detailed session tomorrow, which also contributed to a BBC documentary about civilians in war-affected areas and how they often look after gardens as a way of trying to retain some semblance of peace and calm in their lives. I want to keep this session as interactive as possible, so we'll kick off with a bit of discussion here, and then we'll open it up to questions, although with an emphasis on questions rather than comments and statements, if that's possible. So the first question that I want to turn to you, Rania, about is you spent a great amount of time in Syria from the beginning of the uprising. You faced huge dangers in doing that. The people who were there obviously faced huge dangers as well. Your book it has many stories of endurance, but many stories of suffering. And I suppose I know in the book you were quite keen to minimize your own role in your reporting. But was it a difficult decision for you to keep going back into a war zone, knowing that there were airstrikes around you, knowing that there's a threat of assassination? People you talk about in the book, some of them are subject to assassination attempts just moments after meeting you.
Not related, by the way.
So was it a difficult decision and was it difficult to move on from that trauma once you take yourself out of that situation as well?
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in this subject. I guess I should start by saying that I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I'm not entering these conflicts for any kind of a thrill. On the contrary, I don't even consider myself a war reporter. I'm not. I'm a reporter who covers the Middle East, and I was also covering parts of South Asia that happened to fall into conflict. When I first started covering Syria, I had covered the uprising and the revolution in Tunis beforehand. From Tunis, I went to Cairo, and then I wanted to see what was happening in Syria. So I made my way there in late February, and I happened to cover some of the first protests in the capital, Damascus. So when I started, that was the scene. But once, I always knew that what was going to happen in Syria wasn't going to be contained to Syria, because whatever happened, if Syria changed in any way, it was going to have an impact well beyond its borders, given its geostrategic importance. And that's what drew me back to the story, time and time again. It's very difficult for us as journalists to see a story, to know there's a story out there, and to not do it. And I was well aware of the threats. I was well aware of the dangers. I mean, I think that the problem is when you don't consider the threats and you don't consider the dangers, when you become so numb to covering things like this that you're not aware of the you're not able to realize just how dangerous it is. I think when you get to that point, you have to stop doing it, because it means that you can't adequately assess the environment in which you're in, and you can become a danger to yourself and to people around you. So I was aware of that all the time, but as a journalist, the story kept drawing me back. It wasn't any kind of like thrill-seeking, it was the story, and it was the people, and it was the importance of what was happening in Syria, and that's what drew me there.
And having seen some of the images that you've seen, the aftermath of airstrikes, the conflict in kind of close up, once you then removed yourself from the situation, once you went back home, was it hard to forget those images? Did you struggle with kind of the fact that you weren't there and people that you were close to were still there?
Yeah, no, I never forget. Every person I've had the privilege to meet is imprinted in my memory. That's just, I can't forget people who I meet, and there are so many over the years. But for me, the act of, if I witness something, if I'm in a hospital when it's struck, or if I'm in on the road and the car in front of me is hit or something like that, I have seen this, but I am there for a reason. I'm there to record it, and I'm there to tell all of you about it. That's my job. And the act of recording and the act of serving as a megaphone, really, so that all of you can see what I saw, so that this incident didn't just happen in isolation and then it was forgotten, that the blood was spilt, has now been seen, not just by me, but by you as well. And that act of recording is in some ways cathartic, because I know that that's my job, and I've done it, at least for that day.
And Lali, as a photojournalist, you're often capturing people at the worst moments of their lives, in hugely traumatic situations. It's obviously a hugely important job. That's how the world is informed about what's going on. But do you ever feel uncomfortable? Do you ever feel torn about whether to take an image or not?
Yeah. I think that's one of the hardest things about being an image maker, is that moral dilemma of whether you take the picture or do you stop and help. And if you're taking the picture, you're not just taking something from somebody, literally. And I think, as Rania said, it's your job really as a journalist to tell the world, and it is your place to report and to show people what's going on. But I sort of think that unless someone is obviously bleeding to death in your arms practically, then I think it's your job as a human being, and it doesn't matter if you're an accountant or a journalist, you've got to help. I think that's the bottom line.
And Osama, I know you've, as well as being a journalist, you've carried out relief work. You've worked with victims of earthquakes and floods. When you're a journalist, how difficult is it to draw that line between getting involved in the story and helping people out who are in dire need, or retaining your distance and not getting involved and just documenting it?
Well, I think that's very important, because you're there to tell the world about that story without being part of that story. And it is a very fine line in doing relief work and telling people about what to do. And there have been multiple instances where I've seen firsthand. It was a New Year's Eve, we were in a camp, freezing conditions, and children were walking barefoot. And people saw that report. People saw us live throughout the day and there was such an outpour of people who wanted to help and support. So I think that's what gives us the strength to carry on, because inherently, as much as the violence that surrounds you and the negativity that we report upon, what it brings out is the good in people. You see those stories, and Rania speaks about hope as well. On March the 15th, it will be 8 years of the Syrian conflict. People who, like me and Rania and others, who've been covering this conflict day in and day out, we find it really hard to see hope. But that is until you sit down with a Syrian who opens up their heart. I was just a couple of weeks ago sitting down with a 7-year-old girl who lost her mother, her brother, and a leg in an airstrike. And I met her after 3 years. So I've seen that transformation, that the flame of hope is still alive. She does have the sparkle in her eye. She does look forward. And despite all of the conditions that she faces, she does cry about it. but that at the end of the day, it's not what describes her overall condition. And I think that is what gives us as journalists both the stamina as well as the conviction to continue to do our job as people who tell the story rather than becoming the story ourselves.
And Rana, in your book, you narrate an experience where an activist who's become a kind of close source of yours starts seeking help from you. He says, oh, who can you connect me with? Can you connect me with influential politicians? Can you get me guns? Exactly, which is beyond the remit, certainly most people would say, of general journalism. But is it hard to explain to people who are living in conflict zones the limits that you can go to help them? Or is it clear enough for them that this is all you can do? You can tell the world, but you can't get involved yourself.
No, I have to make that clear. I have to make that clear. You're referring to a case where an activist would often contact me in the early hours of the morning and ask me if I could get him, literally, if I can get him weapons or if I could connect him to people who could. And you have to make that clear. And in my experience, once I've made that clear, then those questions stop and they realize. I tell them, this is what I can do. I'm here to tell your story, to verify it, and that's my role. I'm not here as an aid worker, I'm not here as a weapons smuggler, I'm not here as anything else. This is my role and this is what I can do, and I can't do more than that. But as a human being, obviously, we'll hold the hands of kids who are crying in hospitals and things like that. I mean, I'm a human first, and then I'm a journalist, but there are certain things which are absolute red lines which I will not and cannot cross.
Providing RPGs is one of those.
For example, yeah.
Is one of those red lines, I imagine. Lali, I'm sure you've never been asked to provide anyone with RPGs necessarily, but have there been moments where you've been tempted to put down the camera and help someone rather than take the shot, or is it take the shot and then help someone? How does it work?
Well, fortunately, I've never been in that situation, but people often, especially working in Afghanistan and Gaza, people see me and think I must be some kind of aid worker or a doctor because I'm Anglo-Saxon. So it's quite hard to, especially in hospitals in northern Afghanistan, it seems to happen all the time, but it's quite hard to just explain that, no, I'm just here to report on what's going on. But depending on which conflict you're working in, it really sort of depends on how people kind of accept that. So somewhere like Afghanistan, where media is still, it's pretty new after so much conflict, and it's still quite respected, it ends up being a little bit easier, I guess, to explain. But in somewhere like Gaza, where there's just been such a saturation of reporting and journalism coming out of there for decades, it's harder for people to accept that you're a journalist because they see journalists coming and going all the time, and nothing changes for people in Gaza. So it's a challenge in that respect. But fortunately, no weapons dealing.
And that's one of the things that comes out in Rania's book is the sense of hope that many people in Syria had at the start of the conflict, that by journalists documenting the atrocities, the human rights abuses that are going on there, that there would be perhaps some kind of international action. One of the kind of refrains that you hear from people is, surely people will come and help. And as the conflict goes on, it becomes clearer, certainly to international observers and I think to the people in Syria, that help isn't really going to come, or it's not coming in the form that they want it to come in. So once that realization happens, does that affect how people relate to you on the ground, and does it affect how you think about your own reporting and what you're really achieving?
Yeah, very much so. In the beginning, when I first started covering Syria, people used to think that they were keen to talk to me. They thought that the world didn't know what was happening in Syria, and they wanted to get that information out. And after a while, it became harder. People would say things like, why should I bother? It became clear that the world knew what was happening, it just didn't seem to care. And it became harder. People would often tell me in interviews, like, why should I talk to you? Why? And I remember once there was, and sometimes it could get dangerous. It could put me in you know, I mean, it could get really heated. I remember once I was in a town and there was an airstrike, and it was a horrific, like dozens of people were killed, and it was just a ferocious airstrike on a town. And a lot of civilians were killed, and there were armed battalions of the Free Syrian Army there, and they were coming into the hospital as well, and they saw me in the hospital with my notepad and pen. So I went to talk to them, and they got very angry, like, why are you here? You journalists, all you do is like come here and you take our stories. Well, how are you helping us? What are you doing? And I knew that I couldn't argue with him. This man was hurt. These men were hurt. They were hyped up, and they were really angry about what was happening. So I just very calmly said, listen, you know I can't do anything except for report and tell the world what's happening here. I'm here with you. I saw what happened. I'm trying to get the story out. What do you want the world to know? And you know, sometimes that would help, because I was there with them, and we were there with them. You know, we weren't, I don't know, maybe if we were phoning in, it might have been a different reaction from some people, but that tended to sort of, you know, mitigate the circumstances. They knew that we were there with them and that we were just trying to do our jobs.
And Osama, you've been reporting on Syria for a number of years as well. Is this, has there been a change that you've noticed in the way that people react to journalists coming in and asking them about their experiences?
Absolutely. Because in the last 8 years, the Syrian conflict has morphed. It is not the same Syria that we entered in 2011. It is not the same Syria that we entered in 2015. It depends on where you're going into Syria, whether you're crossing it from the Iraqi border, whether you're crossing it from the Turkish border, where you're trying to get access from the Jordanian or the Lebanese border. So a lot has changed in the last 8 years, and it has had an impact on the expectations of people as well. Because as Rania said, initially, people were very outspoken, they were very keen, they wanted to come and tell you their stories. But now you go, and whether it's right after an airstrike or a massive shelling attack, or whether it's a refugee camp. I remember we were at a refugee camp in Aleppo countryside where people had fled from Homs. And there was a little boy who wanted to speak to us. And we went in and we asked the mother for permission, and she said, absolutely not. I'm not going to allow you to use my child to sell your journalism.
Really?
And that was a really stark reality which struck us at that point, that we are being seen as voyeurs and who come in and document this, and nothing happens. And people have a certain expectation that once I tell you my story, somebody somewhere will listen to it. And that is a constant struggle that we face as well, especially for a prolonged conflict like Syria. Is every deployment you come back and you ask yourself the question that, you know, was it worth it? Did it make an impact? You know, the world knows about this. I mean, I was covering the fall of Aleppo, and people were screaming at the top of their lungs from all media networks. And we were struggling to show pictures and what not to show, because you don't want to sanitize the war, but you don't want to put people off watching telly as well. So it is a constant struggle for journalists to tell that story.
And how do you reconcile it with yourself? I mean, do you come back then and think it was worth it, or are there moments of doubt where you think, actually, perhaps, you know, what we're doing isn't helping enough?
Well, I think that moment of doubt, I don't know about others, but I've always, you know, grappled with it. I had a very frank discussion with the director of news, and if you cover it for so long and there are stories that really impact you as a human being, then you do ask yourself that question. And we had this very frank discussion, and I said, you know what, 500,000 people dead. It's been 7 years. What impact did we do? And in that discussion, the thing came out was that, now imagine if we weren't every single day hammering on the people who control the powers that be, if we weren't hammering with them with those images, with that information that you are killing people, that we know that you're committing war crimes. Imagine if it wasn't that, and the death toll could have been 2 million or more.
Mm. And Rania, one of the main kind of issues that people now associate with the Syrian conflict, which of course started as a peaceful protest movement, is of course the growth of ISIS, of Daesh. And certainly in Western media, a lot of the focus that has been given to the conflict in Syria has been through that lens, about the growth of ISIS and about the threat that it poses to Western countries. Did you find people in Syria who were frustrated by that? Because, of course, many more people, according to kind of most data, have been killed by the Syrian regime than have been killed by extremist groups, despite, of course, their obvious brutality.
Well, I'd say that the other thing about this issue is the fact that Islamic State killed many more Syrians and Iraqis and Muslims than it did Europeans or Americans or anybody else. And that is something that is, I feel, is lost in the debate when we focus on the Western victims of Islamic State, and we don't pay attention to the fact that it is so massively skewed in terms of the numbers. They killed many more people in the countries where they were present. And this was something that I think was missing from the coverage. I mean, we can even see now the rush to talk to foreign ISIS wives, Islamic State wives. You know, they were like a novelty, I guess, in some ways, relative to
I saw a tweet from one terrorism researcher today saying he thinks the ratio to ISIS fighters to journalists in northern Syria right now is 1-to-1, because many Western journalists, understandably so, are trying to plug interviews out of the refugee camps.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's understandable, and it's a very difficult situation, and you know, they're there, and it's very hard. So, you know, my hat's off to them. But you know, I watched the rise of these groups in Syria, and it was clear, it was obvious. I mean, I remember in 2014, when the group that was then called ISIS was declared, 2014, when they declared their so-called caliphate, I remember doing a lot of media, and some of the journalists said, well, where did this group suddenly come from? It didn't suddenly come from anywhere. It was always there. We were reporting it. We were showing the rise of these extremists inside Syria. We were showing what they were doing to Syrians. And this group was, of course, you know, not the first time that we'd seen it. It was just the most recent incarnation of the group that was formed after the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. It has been known by many names, but the seed is the same. And, you know, in the same way now that we're seeing it being reduced back to a very small, hardcore group of fighters that will no doubt, once again, re-emerge from that seed in some form in the future. But yeah, no, so it was a bit frustrating to see the emphasis on the Western victims of Islamic State and not also look at the broader picture. It's the same with the refugee crisis. We hear about the European refugee crisis precipitated by the Syrian war, but the crisis is in Syria's neighboring states. It's in Jordan, which is a water-parched country which is now sharing its meager resources with hundreds of thousands of Syrians. It's in Turkey, which hosts almost 4 million refugees, the largest refugee population in the world. It's in Lebanon, where at one point every fourth person was a Syrian. That's where the refugee crisis is. But once again, the coverage tends to get skewed, at least in the English language media.
And Lali, when it comes to your work, do you find it difficult at times to get news outlets interested in international news? Is there often a big focus on what's going on domestically within countries, despite the kind of awful stories that you're trying to cover?
Completely. It's a real challenge. I've never worked for anyone. I've always been freelance. And working for 5 years in Afghanistan, it was really tough towards the end to make people, to get editors interested in what was going on. And the war still rumbles on in Afghanistan. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's just that we don't have troops there, so the Western media, the British media, isn't that interested. And it's a real challenge to kind of make people at home be interested, because, you know, the UK is in dire straits at the moment with Brexit, falling economy, political instability. People don't really care about what's happening in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Myanmar. So it's such a challenge to engage people. And I live in a really rural area of England, in a village of 300 people between two towns, one pretty affluent and one not very affluent. And if I go to either town and try and ask people what they think about what's going on in Afghanistan or Syria or anywhere, they're not really interested. And I don't know whether that's the British sort of fascination with celebrity, with ego, or whether it's just the crumbling media institutions, but it is permanently a challenge. And one is always under scrutiny as well by your peer group, I suppose, internationally, to see what you're doing, and that's another challenge as well.
My name is Ahmed Hussain. All three of you are storytellers. It's a horrible story, Syria. Consider that we are children sitting here and you're telling a story. Every story has a lesson. What do you think? What's your take? What's the lesson from the Syrian conflict till date?
Oh, big question. Rania, do you want to take it on first?
The lesson of the Syrian conflict. There are many lessons. It depends on the audience. I think that in terms of international relations, it will be a lesson in the, what's the word I'm looking for? How some laws are only on paper and not in practice. How prohibitions against chemical weapons mean nothing based on what we've seen happen in Syria with the repeated use of banned weapons. I think it's a case study in the power of the veto at the UN Security Council, and what we can become numb to, what we as people can become numb to if our leaders are making all sorts of have other reasons for ignoring things. What about us as people? I mean, charities like all sorts of NGOs and the United Nations are always crying about their lack of funding for the Syria relief effort. What about us as people if it doesn't move us to at least try and do something by donating to these organizations? As journalists, I think there are many lessons as well in terms of how to, as Syria became increasingly difficult to get into, and our colleagues were kidnapped and many of them were killed in gruesome ways. Understandably, many people started reporting from a distance, so there are questions that we need to have as an industry about how to cover a conflict from a distance, how to verify information on social media, which is coming from people who are often, using names that are completely anonymous, and we aren't even really sure where they are. So how do we go about doing our work when it becomes too dangerous to be in the place that we're covering? So there are many different lessons based on who is the audience for those lessons.
Osama, do you have anything to add on that, particularly on this issue of verification? Because as Rania said, the Syria conflict saw these terrible deliberate targeting of journalists in a very high-profile way, and it meant that many news organizations were really very reluctant to go into many parts of Syria, certainly to have people going in there for any kind of extended amount of time, because they didn't want to expose their journalists to the risk. That means that you're, as Rania says, you're dealing with people perhaps by Skype or WhatsApp, people that you who clearly have at least some kind of agenda, even if it's a benign agenda. But how do you then deal with that and remain objective and try and verify the information without being able to get there yourself at times to the affected areas?
Well, I think before I begin, I think the biggest lesson here is that we need to remind ourselves constantly that the conflict in Syria is not over. The Islamic State might have crumbled, but that was just one factor of that very, very gruesome conflict. We have watched 500,000 people die in slow motion on live TV, essentially. And we've got to remind ourselves of that the suffering for millions and millions of Syrians inside Syria and outside Syria is not over. So that's lesson number one. Number two, the point of verification. How do you verify that information? There was a point after 2014 for about 3 years that I couldn't enter Syria. We just wouldn't be able to, as much as we wanted to. We were going in with smugglers, we were going in with people who we did not know. We did not know whether we would be kidnapped by the people who were taking us in, or would they be selling us to one group or the other. So it became very hairy, so we couldn't go in. But during that time, because I'd been working on Syria for a number of years beforehand, I had all of those contacts in local committees, activists, journalists, coffee sellers who became FSA fighters. And we saw that those Skype contacts, one after the other, started going dark as well. In Aleppo, there was one building collapse which killed 3 of the people who I used to get information verified with. So as the conflict prolongs itself, it becomes harder and harder. But you cannot, and I think that's the mistake that a lot of journalists, and there's a lot of lack of faith in journalism because of the speed of that everything is happening now and it needs to be reported right now. There have been a lot of compromises that have been made by journalists amongst ourselves on the verification of stories, verification of news. And that has led to the rise of this so-called fake news crutches, so to speak, that people can come out and say that, oh, Ghouta was fake, it was staged, it was actors. But we know that we saw those lifeless bodies without wounds. We saw those mass graves of 130 odd children who just asphyxiated because of chlorine gas. So those are the kind of things that I think a lot of emphasis needs to be built on, like Rania said, on how we do this business. And our only sources that are reliable are the people who we know, people who we trust, not a YouTube account or a Twitter handle. It has to be with how much effort and energy and time have you put into place to build those contacts. And a lot of mistakes are made once you realize that that didn't exist or was ignored.
And Lali, because of some of these dangers that journalists face going into conflict zones, whether it's Syria, whether it's Afghanistan, often many news organizations decide the only way to do it is if you're doing what's called an embed. If you're going in with a force, whether that's the rebels, whether it's the British Army, and of course that gives you access to areas that potentially you wouldn't be able to access otherwise. But at the same time, then you're spending a lot of time and your safety is dependent on one party in the conflict. So how, I know that you've, I think, spent some time with the British Army in Afghanistan. How difficult is it to retain your objectivity and your distance from the subject when you're spending so much time with them there?
It's certainly a challenge, whether you're working with the Brits, the Americans, the French, whichever, because you become, you're reliant on these people for your security in a very dangerous environment. And you build up a rapport with the people you spend a lot of time with. But I think objectivity is something that, if you're a journalist, it's innate in you. You just have to be able to step back. And I think that, trying not to be partisan or biased is a challenge. And I think that's where I was going to talk about a lesson, actually. My lesson would be empathy and a plea for empathy. Because however much time I've spent with, US, UK forces, I've also spent time with the Taliban in southern Afghanistan. And you can go in and think, well, whatever you think about the Taliban and what they've done to the country, but then actually spend time speaking to them, and a different dialogue emerges, and a different conversation emerges. And you might not think personally whether it's right or wrong, but there's a clearer understanding, and it creates empathy just by discussing things with both sides. And I think that's key to any kind of war reporting.
I question whether I should have that word in the subtitle of the book. And I decided on it because the hope is not from me. It's not about me seeing hope. It's about the people in the book, some of them seeing hope. And I figure if they haven't given up, how dare I? So it comes from them.
Well, I would say that hope is, and you'd be surprised to know that every Syrian that you meet wants to go back home. They might not have anything to return to, but they want to go back. So you would be interviewing a father who's lost 6 children, a wife, an uncle, and a brother, and his home is being destroyed. But when on that last question of what do you think, what is the future for you, he said, you know what, after a couple of years, I'd like to rebuild my life. I would like to go back home. So that hope actually, and I've covered conflict from Afghanistan to other places, but there's a lot of, it is difficult to express in words, but the Syrians are different people. they would say Alhamdulillah and all of that while they're describing their pain and their suffering. So that hope is there. The question is that should we continue to ignore it? Because doing a hopeful story doesn't get picked up by newspapers. It doesn't give you the clicks or the likes. It doesn't make the headlines. And that is the constant fight. You spoke about fatigue of the conflict. It's not just amongst people. It's amongst newsrooms as well. Editors in newsrooms, if it's only 4 people dead, it doesn't make the headline. And that is something that we constantly have to grapple with. So that hope actually does drive us to go back to that story, to continue to tell that story of the people who shouldn't be discarded by the rest of the world as, too bad, this happened, let's move on. And that is the essence of what we do, is that bringing out the stories of these people to an international audience, it does 2 things. One, it creates that empathy, that human connection, that this is somebody who is just like me. You know, when a mother tells you that they were on the rooftop playing when a mortar hit them, you can relate to it, that you do play with your children or your cousins or your family. So one is empathy, and the other is that their suffering is not over. As human beings of this connected global village, there is a certain responsibility that all of us share. And that collective responsibility is about caring for the people who are around us, who may be distant, but they're still suffering. And I think that is the essence of hope and the message that we try to give with telling stories of people.
And Lali, a lot of your work is about people retaining a semblance of calm or normality amidst all the suffering.
Well, yeah, in latter years, I became rather inured to suffering and became rather numb to it in Afghanistan. And I ended up trying to find personal solace through the means of gardens, because where I lived in Afghanistan, we all had lovely gardens, and it was a real escape from the world outside and the reality of what was going on outside. And the more I looked and the more I spent time with people in various parts of the country, the more I saw that it was a universal thing. They too were trying to escape their reality by gardening. And obviously gardens have a practical sense. They can provide food and shade and beauty at the same time, and therapy. And I took this to other countries and found a very, very similar story in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Ukraine. And I know that there are other countries where I couldn't quite get there, where the same thing is happening, and it is really about hope. So in answer to your question, I think you were embedded with your own work as much as we have been with ours. And it's having the ability to step back and to see beauty and calm in very small things. And the people of Syria, and they say Alhamdulillah, and they are believing in that there is something that will drive them forward, take the human spirit forward, because without hope, then there's no future, really.
I mean, I think that as my colleague said, the war isn't over yet. We have to remember that. It's not over, but the outcome of the war is clear at this point. Assad has won. He and his allies have won, so that remains intact. That system remains intact. And his alliance with the Russians and the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah is one of the key reasons for his victory in Syria. The other side lost. The Saudis, the Qataris, the Gulfis, Turkey, although Erdogan is maneuvering. The West lost in Syria. Simple as that. I'm increasingly interested in. We often follow the quote-unquote bang-bang of the war. The dynamic period, but then what happens after? And often the media moves on. All of that trauma that you talked about, the trauma that is passed on from person to person is very important, and it's key. And I think what happens with that, if it stops there and if there is healing, depends on how the conflict ends. It depends on if there is accountability. It depends on if there is a sense of justice. It depends on if there is any information about the tens of thousands of missing, of the disappeared, if there is any form of closure. I doubt that any of that is going to happen in Syria. It doesn't seem to be the case. It didn't happen in Lebanon, where I'm from, where the place of my heritage before. So those hatreds and those tensions, they simmer. They simmer at a lower temperature, almost ensuring a future rupture at some point, because as you said, those feelings are often passed on from generation to generation. But I'm increasingly interested in these post-conflict societies and how they reform, if at all. On a neighborly level, how do people who were fighting each other, killing each other at one point, come back to an area, if they do? Or does the demography of the place change almost permanently in some way? So they're all important questions that I think we need to consider, editors permitting, of course, because they're the gatekeepers and they prefer the bang-bang and the dynamism of conflict, but I think that they're very important questions that need to be addressed.
And if I could, sorry, just add to that. I think there's that question, you could bring it home to the Pakistani audience right now. Because there's a lot of war hysteria that is happening right now. There's a lot of proponents for war, that these so-called keyboard warriors that you see, who are pro-war, who've never seen war, who've never seen suffering, who've never seen the impact of war. And I think that kind of is the gist of our work as well, that we try and get to give people that this is the suffering that happens during, but what comes after. I was at a center which makes arm limbs for Syrians. When I met them 4 years ago, they had 300 cases. Right now, after the conflict has subsided, they have 2,000 cases. When the war normalizes, people need to move on with their lives. When they need to move on with their lives, they need those limbs to survive. And that's just a physical aspect. Now imagine those children in their millions who've seen their parents being blown to bits. That's something that will never leave them.
And Lali, we're talking about the Syrian conflict, which has of course gone on for 7 years now. We talk about the conflict in Afghanistan, that's gone on even longer. It's a 17-year-old war. Preceded by decades of conflict, really. Yeah. When I go to Afghanistan, I often think this is a country where the entire nation, more or less, must have some kind of form of a post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. Is that something that comes across to you when you're working there?
Completely, but I think perhaps almost more shocking is how normalized it is, and it's quite ordinary and commonplace for someone just to say, oh well, their family's from Kunduz and they were blown up, in a very blasé way. And when you actually think about the statistics and what's actually happened, it's horrific. I've actually done quite a lot of research into post-traumatic stress disorder amongst troops returning home. And I think the lessons that have been learned, well, not learned there, can be taken to people in Gaza and Syria, especially children. And I remember in 2009, after the war there was, I spoke to a child psychologist, and they were basically crying out for child psychologists to go to Gaza because there were so many children. I think it's a very young population anyway. I think half the population is under the age of 20. But they were crying out for psychologists to go and help these children who'd just been very badly hit over the course of, I think the war was only 3.5 weeks long. But it's a sustained attack in Gaza, I suppose. And I think one of the interesting things that came out about some research I did, it was how post-traumatic stress disorder can be fostered and nurtured depending on where you come from and how susceptible you are to it. And I wonder, I'm just wondering if there's a link between perhaps people who are around it all the time, people who are brought up in a world where trauma is commonplace, versus people who have come from somewhere completely outside and their ability to cope. But then, I don't know, I've never experienced my family being hurt or attacked or anything. But I think that it's certainly, I think it's an issue that should be addressed more and more and more. It should be part and parcel of the story of like how people are actually, how the civilians are affected by conflict and what can be done to relieve their suffering post-conflict.